everybody, this is Carter, and welcome to this episode of Making It Up, the conversation series where I get to sit down and chit chat with other writers. Before we get to today's guest, I just want to mention that my company, Unbound Writer, is now taking registrations for my October 2024 intensive coaching and writing retreat, 2.5-day program here in Boulder, Colorado. So you can check that out at unboundwriter.com. These retreats are a blast, and it's a lot of instruction. It's a lot of kind of self-discovery, depending wherever you are in your writing journey. And it's also some time to write. And we also have guest speakers, agents, and editors, and other best-selling novelists. So please check it out. I've got new pricing there, and there's places to stay within the retreat itself. So if you have any questions, there's links to chat with me on the website as well. So again, just unboundwriter.com. And I'm also offering one-on-one coaching services, and we're just about to launch our first set of 3 writing online courses. So let's talk about today's guest. I got a little jazzed about today's guest because, whenever I talk to somebody who has a career within Hollywood, I get a little excited because sometimes I think that's what I was meant to do, or that's what I've always wanted to do, is I really want to be involved in the TV and the film industry. And as you'll hear towards the end of this podcast, I mentioned a potential desire to write a screenplay on a particular idea that I have. But it's all kind of a dream. And I know Hollywood is not all that it's made out to be. And I've heard that time and time again, but I still love talking about TV and movies. So I was very happy to have on the show today, Marc Guggenheim. So Marc Guggenheim started his life or started his career as a lawyer. But even in law school, he was writing teleplays, and he eventually left the practice and moved out to Los Angeles from Boston and started getting into the industry. Staff writer on The Practice back in the 90s, worked on Law and Order, and has done a lot of different writing and producing, and also comic book writing over the years. And along his journey, he wanted to write a novel, and he had this idea for a novel. And in fact, when this book comes out, as he stated, it was about 10 years ago that he started thinking about the idea for this. He eventually then in 2017 wrote a different book that didn't really go anywhere. And he was kind of down on it. In my opinion, it was probably a really good practice book for him. Just so when you get to the real book, your skills are a little bit more honed. But then he did write in the pandemic, he did write that debut novel, and which is coming out this summer, and it's called In Any Lifetime. And it's got a beautiful blurb from Guillermo del Toro, which is pretty bitchin'. And it was just great to talk to him about how did he come up with the idea, like how did he make that transition from writing many, many, many screenplays and comic books to and teleplays to long form novels, and we talked a lot about emotion, about really having that emotion come out, which you can do, I think, much easier in a novel than maybe in some of those other mediums. So it was fascinating. And we even got into a little asides about the movie Michael Clayton and the show Breaking Bad. So I got to nerd out a little bit on all that kind of stuff. So I really enjoyed my conversation. His book, In Any Lifetime, looks fantastic. This is my conversation with Marc Guggenheim.
It's a lot of people, but in Los Angeles, it's just all urban sprawl.
Yeah, right.
There's no real infrastructure. There's no real city.
Right.
I wish I liked strip malls more. If I like strip malls more,
It's the
I
place
would.
to be.
Oh my God, I'd be like over the moon. I would be, so happy. But alas, I don't have the same love for strip malls that I guess whoever planned out the city of Los Angeles had.
So I want to, obviously I want to get through your career in the film industry and leading up to, I know what was a long process writing this novel, but I'm just curious, kind of growing up in Long Island, What kind of kid were you? Were you that creative kid who was looking to create, or were you just a goofball like the rest of us?
I was a weird kid. I didn't really fit any kind of category. I was kind of like, too cool for for the nerdy kids, but not, too nerdy for the cool kids. I was the editor-in-chief of my high school's literary magazine, but I barely did any writing for it.
Hmm.
Very, very strange. I just
Why did you
didn't.
want to do that? What was the attraction to? Because that's a very nuanced position to hold.
Yeah. Well, I was really into art at the time, and the literary magazine included like, publishing student art. So for the longest time, art was actually my creative
Hmm.
outlet. And then I kind of overcorrected when I was in law school and switched to creative writing, and never really looked back. But yeah, I was a strange kid. I was not, I was not at all popular. I was bullied. I
Hmm.
was, I was, again, sort of like contradictions. Everyone thought I was like, valedictorian level. But instead I was actually in reality just a total B student. So,
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
it was, yeah, it was all the worst of all options.
So you were ready to get off to college then, it sounds like.
Oh my God, I was so ready. I couldn't wait to get out of college. Couldn't wait. I was so happy. And I really college was where I was able to reinvent myself.
So where
And
did
one
you go to school?
SUNY Albany, which has now been rechristened U Albany.
Okay. And then what did you study there? Like what were you thinking about doing?
I was an English major,
Okay.
and at that time, I actually knew I wanted to become an attorney. So, there was no pre-law at U Albany, so my two options were political science or English, and I had no interest in political science. So,
Hmm.
I knew pretty much from the get-go that I'd be an English major.
Why did you want to go? Why did you know you wanted to get into law?
I was very enamored with the idea that, I knew I wanted to work in like civil litigation. And I was very enamored with the idea that if you are wronged by someone, there's this societal mechanism by which you can redress those wrongs. So, like, for example, totally hypothetically, I'm sure that this wasn't the case with me. Like, let's say you were bullied all
Hmm.
throughout elementary and high school. You develop a certain sense of, right and wrong, and a certain sense of grievances, and you become fascinated with this, really this mechanism of dispute resolution.
Yeah.
Um, so that's I got just suckered into all the things I thought the law provide for, which of
Eh,
course, spoiler alert, it doesn't provide for any of that.
But it's fascinating to me. I love talking to writers, and I love kind of hearing about their development and their pathway. And it's, I don't know if it's the universe or a coincidence, but lately I've talked to a lot of people, a lot of writers who went to law school. And my daughter is the one who edits this podcast, and she kind of helps with me. And she's in the process of applying to law
No, no,
school.
don't do it. Don't do it,
But
Carter's
she doesn't
daughter.
want to
Don't
be a
do it.
lawyer.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good. That's good. Actually, the thing is, I think everyone should go to law school. I think, it's funny. There's nothing in higher education like quite like law school. In law school, you don't actually learn any skills, which is terrifying when you then find yourself suddenly in a courtroom with a law degree, and a law license. But you don't learn facts, you don't learn skills. What you learn is an entirely different way of thinking, which to this day, I find utterly fascinating. And like I said, it's really unique among any sort of academic endeavor. And I think it's the type of, new way of thinking that we could all, we could all benefit from. I wish that was something that was more prevalent in our society.
I mean, and it fascinates me because I don't know anything about law school. So everything I learn is through my daughter, and just even through the process of taking the LSATs, realizing that, oh, they're not, you don't actually have to know anything. It's all about, like you said, a different way of thinking,
Yeah.
and different kind of deductive reasoning. That's very specific, and you have to kind of learn that way, but it's about thinking. And I'm like, wow,
Yes.
that's really weird. But I
Yeah.
guess it begets the ability to flourish in law school, and I guess that is somehow applicable to then when you actually learning case law and all that kind of stuff when you're actually practicing. um but
It
it's
is
sounds
helpful. Yeah,
miserable to me.
it's I don't know. I loved law school. I found it completely fascinating, and I really felt my brain changing,
Hmm.
and the way I approach the world and approach problems changing, and that I wouldn't give up for anything. But the actual practice of law, that's less fun.
So you went in, did you go into civil litigation?
I did. I did. I
Yeah.
became a commercial litigator, which
Yeah.
basically means that usually there's at least one company involved in the case. But I did, things from like breach of contract cases to collection cases to stock fraud cases, some white collar crime,
Hmm.
a little bit of everything. And it was interesting. I mean, I wouldn't say that my life was boring by any means. But that more often than not, that translated to a lot of stress. And eventually
Yeah.
I sort of realized, oh, wow, the system, it doesn't work the way TV shows and movies make you think it does.
Yeah, I could see that being frustrating, because the other thing I find interesting about writers is just this idea that I've seen evidenced over and over again, that if you are a writer or if you are a creative person who wants to put those creative skills to use, whether you realize that or not, it will eventually worm its way out of you. Um, and and one of the way it worms its way out of you is through kind of this existential dissatisfaction with whatever you're currently doing. And I can imagine talking to you and hearing about this, that your passion for law was driven by a sense of justice. And if that's the one thing that's being driven by, and that's the one thing you're not actually finding in the practice of it, of course it's going to be stressful because it's
Yeah.
a lot of work and you're not getting that passion, that then maybe your creative endeavors are the thing that fuel you. You probably are working just as hard now, but you
Oh
love it.
God, yeah. I mean, probably even more so, which is hard to imagine. But yeah, I'm sure I work even more hours now than I did back as an attorney. But I do love it, and my worst day as a writer is still better than my best day as an attorney.
Right.
Um,
Right. Because you're creating.
so because I'm creating, I will also say, like, I think I was a decent attorney. Friends of mine who I had practiced with, they get down on me for being too evaluating my legal skills too negatively. So I should probably say I was a good attorney, but I would look at
Mhm.
the partners I was working for and I would go, they're great attorneys,
Mhm.
and I will never be that great.
Right.
And I one of the things that I found frustrating about the practice of law was I could never, no matter how hard I worked, I didn't have the latent talent to practice at the level that I wanted to practice at.
Hmm.
If I'm going to do something, I really want to do it at the highest level possible. And I knew I would never get there as an attorney. But for some reason, I felt like I might be able to get there as a writer. Um, so it's very frustrating to do something where you feel like there's a constant limit or a ceiling on your abilities. So
Hmm.
that was one of the many, many reasons why I had to leave the
But
practice of law.
I think to have the self-awareness, though, to recognize that is important, and it allows you to kind of have that, make that pivot. I also wonder about, you think about something like sports. I think it's very easy to say, I just don't have that talent to compete at that level. I think
Right.
that's just a physical thing. And I believe in that raw natural talent. When it comes to the creative arts or being a lawyer or whatever, you kind of wonder, like, okay, is it my own maybe lack of talent that's keeping me from those higher echelons, or is it just my recognizable lack of passion? Like these guys who are performing at the top level, they live for this, like I live for writing books.
Right.
I wonder if that was potentially a limitation as well. It's just, you have to throw your passion into it, and that might not be there.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think I struggled a lot with I don't think I had a lack of passion, but I had a lack of comfort really. It's funny, like I I'm helping a friend of mine out with a case now, and
Hmm.
I'm like, oh yeah, this is why I hated practicing law. Um, I to practice law, I think at a high level, you actually need to divorce yourself a little bit from the case,
Hmm.
and you have to not second guess the decisions you make on behalf of your client. And I could never shut that part of my brain off. I could never prevent myself from constantly second guessing. Did I
Hmm.
do that right? Was this the right move? Was that the right move? And as a result, I didn't, get a decent night's sleep in 5 years. And that way of being at a minimum is not sustainable.
It's almost like having too much of a moral conscience is a detriment in that field, it sounds like.
A little bit, a little bit. It definitely is. I think you need to have a certain constitution in
Yeah.
order to practice law,
Right.
particularly as a litigator. There's sort of very roughly speaking, there's two sides to being a lawyer. There's the transactional side, that's people who are doing contracts and trusts and estates and mergers and acquisitions. And then there's the litigation side, which is, someone suing someone or someone
Yeah.
prosecuting someone. And they're about as different as, as two things get.
Yeah.
They are two professions that really bear no resemblance to each other, even though you go to the same law school and you take the same bar exam at the end of the day.
That's interesting. So, so then what was the wild transition from doing law to going to LA and and getting into TV, movies, comics?
Well, it wasn't that. I mean, it was wild in the sense that it seemed crazy at the time, but it wasn't wild in the sense that it was unmotivated or sudden. Basically, I had been writing teleplays and screenplays since I was in my third year of law school when my brother Eric got me into it. And I'd been writing on the side while I was practicing, honing my craft, to the point where by the time I was ready to actually make the move and quit my job in Boston and move out to Los Angeles, I already had a manager. I had
Hmm.
had what I would call fans around town. I knew that there was potential for me, not a guarantee of a job by any means, but I knew that it wasn't a complete crazy, wild swing. And at the time, there was something called staffing season, which was a particular period of the year where shows would staff up, their writing staffs. So I scheduled my move west to coincide with that staffing season period. So
Hmm.
it was all sort of very, you know, it was very lawyerly. It was very regimented and scheduled and deliberate. Um, and that's all the stuff you can plan for. But at the end of the day, what really broke me in was I got lucky. I had written a sample script that went to the head of David E. Kelly's company. David Kelly, you know him
Hmm.
from,
Hmm. Sure.
LA Law, The Practice,
Right.
Ally
Big
McBeal.
90s.
Yes. Well, and now big, 21st century writer. He's doing
Mhm.
Presumed Innocent for Apple. He did Big Little Lies. And he was looking for first year writers who used to be lawyers to put them on the staff of the practice. And
Oh,
not only did I check off those two boxes, but I also had the added benefit of practicing in the jurisdiction where the show itself took place, which was Boston. So it
that's
was
so interesting. Yeah.
obnoxiously lucky, right place, right time kind of
Hmm.
situation.
So that's how you started kind of cutting your teeth in the act and getting
Yep.
paychecks for doing
Yep.
that.
That was my
But
first paid gig.
but I don't want to dismiss lightly the fact that you were in law school, third year law school, and you're writing teleplays. I mean, that's not kind of a hobby thing people do on the side. So there was some kind of like, this would be a really cool life if in a pipe dream this ever came to be, I assume, kind of going on in your head then.
Yeah, it's funny. I look back on that sort of basically 5 year period where I was writing not for a paycheck, but just writing to write. And I look back on it and go, wow, I was doing that. I was devoting a lot of time to it, a lot of effort to it, but I didn't have a goal in mind. I wasn't
Right.
with the goal of breaking in. It wasn't with the goal of becoming a professional writer. It was actually with a much less lofty goal, which was just to hone my craft.
Right.
And I was really sort of just driven to do that for its own sake. And to the point where what happened was my getting myself to a place and my craft to a place that I felt confident in, that happened to coincide with the bloom falling off the rose, as far as the legal profession was concerned for me. So
Interesting.
um, it was, it's funny. I look back on it, I'm like, wow, it was just a pure, it was totally pure. It wasn't driven by any sort of professional aspirations. And it just happened to line up, in time with me feeling like maybe I'm not going to practice law for the rest of my life.
Right. It's kind of an awakening, which is what
Yes.
happened to me. I started writing in my early 30s with zero background experience, and it just kind of happened. Like on one day, it
Yeah.
just happened.
Yeah.
And so you go into this profession, or not even a profession at that point, but something that you're so not used to doing. And right, you're not thinking about it professionally. You're thinking, and I think you said hone your craft. And I think that's exactly right. It's like, well, I want to see if I can get good at this, whatever
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
means. And you don't know if you're good until you start sharing, querying agents in the case
Yeah.
of a novel, and then they'll tell you, and then you just keep going at it. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, this is starting to feel kind of real.
Yeah.
And because like if you go into this profession, and I coach as well, and I tell my students, I'm like, if let's figure out your why. Why are you writing? Let's figure that out before one more word is written, and
Right.
really let's explore it. And if your why has anything to do with, I want to make money doing this, you should really take a good long look at that.
Yeah.
But if your why is like, I'm just driven by this, I can't picture myself not doing this, whatever happens with it, then good things will happen, because that means you're going to commit to it and you're going to spend
Yes.
every day, a few minutes every day, working on that craft.
That's right.
But it takes years. And sometimes you fall into a lucky timing thing, which, is probably also just, in a way, you were probably almost manifesting that. Like you were committed to it, and good things happen when you have that focus, I think. So
I think
yeah, it
so.
was lucky at the time, but it was
It
probably
was
meant to
certainly
be.
lucky. I think, I'd like to think that I would have gotten hired eventually, on some show, by
Right,
hook or by crook. But it did, it was a classic example of, it took me 5 years to become an overnight success.
right. I mean, that's it's taken me 20 years to become an overnight success, because that's the nature of the industry, especially if you're, I think if you're in Hollywood, there's a lot of competition, but there's opportunities to be a working writer. If you're a novelist, if that's all you're trying to do, there's so much that's not in your control. And like you can write the best book, and like maybe who knows, and takes you a year and nobody wants it.
Yep.
But you just keep doing it because you love it. But so now then you're a professional writer, and then you're surrounded by stories all the time. How did you get into the comic books?
Oh, good question. Well, I'm a huge comic book fan. I've been
Yeah.
a big comic book fan my whole life. And I even interned at Marvel back when I was in
Oh,
college.
cool.
And I think had there been a clearer path into comics, I might have been tempted by it. I
Because
might
you
have
were
been tempted
also
to take it.
you had an artistic background. So were you
Yeah.
inking comics as well as writing them, or you were mostly writing them?
I was mostly writing. I did when I was an intern at Marvel. I actually did. I colored a story. I don't think my art was ever really up to. It was never up to the standards of a comic book. Because to draw a comic book, you've got to not only have a really good artistic sensibility and have a really good artistic style, but you have to be good at storytelling,
Mhm.
visual storytelling. You have to, be able to draw with enough precision that the characters that you're drawing can actually quote unquote act on the page.
Right, right. You're a
And I just,
director kind of in a way. So if a character
yes,
has to look at you a certain way off the page and convey like what they would in a film scene, that's a
right.
right. That requires a pretty high level of talent to be able to pull that off.
Yes. Yes, it's a very high level of talent, and it's funny, and not a lot. There's a lot of great artists that I know who are absolutely terrific artists, but they don't they just don't have that club in their bag. They don't know how to,
Mm-hmm.
have the characters that they're drawing sort of, act or perform on the page. So yeah,
Hmm.
it's a very specific skill that I didn't even come close to possessing. And I also, like I said, I didn't see a path, towards working in comics in any capacity. So I didn't really give it serious thought. I think also, there was probably a part of me that was like, oh, that's too risky. That's
Yeah.
that's too scary. But I was very lucky. I, sort of came up in the television business around the same time that Joe Quesada, who at the time was the editor in chief of Marvel, was hiring people out of television to write comics. Kevin Smith and Joe Straczynski sort of paved the way for me. And I was coming
Mm-hmm.
off of Law and Order, which was sort of a, impressive credit at the time. And it allowed me to get into comics in a way that I don't think I would have, I would have had but for my television background. I sort of often like to say that in many ways, Hollywood is easier to break into as a writer than comics. And
Mm.
because in Hollywood, at least there's things like, at least there were things like staffing season, there's managers, there's agents, there's people who can get you a gig. Comic books, especially on the writing side of comics, doesn't have any of those things. Um, you
So it's
know,
more who
it,
you know and
it's a little who you know. It's a little, I mean, the truth is generally speaking, the only way to break into comics is to actually just do them. And then hope that you get noticed by one of the major publishers. I got lucky in the sense that my, work in television sort of established my bona fides that, there were people at Marvel who felt, comforted enough by those bona fides to say, okay, that can translate over into comics.
interesting. So you're out working in LA and you're you go through a multitude of jobs and different types of practices. And then at some point you say to yourself, I've got a story idea for a novel. Or did it start out like that? Did it start out as something else?
Well, it's funny. So I had written a novel back in 2017,
Oh, okay.
and it was a good experience. Don't think I was I don't think I was a good enough writer at the time to execute on the concept. I think the concept was stronger than the execution. But I really did enjoy it. I enjoyed working in prose. And I had this idea that for what became my novel In Any Lifetime, I had this idea that I was very enamored with, and I've been sort of working on in my notebook for years and years and years, and playing around with it as, do I do this as a screenplay? Do I do this as a
That's what I
graphic
was going to
novel?
ask. Why not do it as a
Um,
screenplay?
yeah, and what happened was COVID.
Hmm.
It was March 2020. The whole world shut down. Television and film production in Hollywood completely shut down.
Hmm.
And I suddenly found myself with a lot of time on my hands. And I went back to my notebook and I went back at looking at this, at this story and going, oh, you know what this should be? This should be a novel.
Hmm.
And I hadn't really considered it at first, I think for two reasons. Number one, like I said, I don't think I was particularly enamored with how my first novel turned out. So I didn't have that confidence of, oh, I can definitely, nail this in novel form. But also, just as importantly, I had never had the time to, writing a novel takes a long time.
It does take a long
It takes
time.
a lot more time than writing a comic book or a TV show or a movie. But suddenly I had that time, because, the world stopped spinning. So I just, sort of dove into it. And I found myself just truly, truly enjoying the experience. In fact, looking back on it, I would say, writing this novel was one of the greatest creative experiences of my life.
Hmm.
It felt, again, it took me back to that place that I was at when I was, practicing law, that just pure writing,
Right.
just writing for the sake of writing, just writing to see how good I can make something. And I wouldn't say the novel poured out of me, but it, um, writing it was just, there was a joy to it,
Yeah.
something, special about writing so unencumbered. That
Yeah,
was
because
nice.
you can be, it's one of the few times you can be wholly, wholly true to your own vision because you haven't shared it with
Yes.
anybody. In fact, I
Yes.
rarely, if ever, even talk about what I'm working on with anyone
Yes.
because I don't know what it's going to be because I don't outline. So, but that's also exciting too because nobody understands this but me. And
Right.
even when you're
Right.
in any kind of industry, you're collaborating and it's not always just your vision. So there is something, yeah, there's an unbridled joy attached to that, even if that vision changes constantly in the course of
Totally.
writing the book.
Yes,
Uh,
and I had so much fun doing it. It was just an enormous, in many ways it was an enormous release because, like I said, this idea had been building up in me, for, at the time it was like 8 years, 8
yeah,
years worth
okay.
of noodling on it and writing it in various different forms, and really having lived with those characters for such a long period of time, it really did feel like a release by the time I was able to actually get it out.
But in any lifetime is then not the same story as your first novel that you were
Oh,
that
no, it's very
yeah.
different.
Okay, so
The
but
first
you had been
novel,
thinking about that and but you wrote something else and
yes,
then you went back to
yes,
this,
yes. The first novel it was actually a legal thriller. It was
right?
much closer to my background and my expertise. But in many ways, I think that that expertise almost hampered that first novel.
Right.
Um, as opposed to, this novel, the protagonist is a quantum physicist, and
Right.
I can barely figure out tip at a restaurant. So,
I can barely
um,
spell physicist.
exactly, exactly. So I know nothing about or I can barely spell quantum. I mean,
Right.
so I think in many ways that ignorance was, paradoxically very freeing.
But I think you recognize something in that process because I'm the exact same way. Like after my third book, I got tired of people telling me people who I know, hey, this character sounds just like you. It's crazy.
Huh.
And I didn't like that. So I started writing from a point of view that I don't know anything about. Of course, you can research and everything, but
Sure.
that becomes in and of itself very freeing because
Yes.
you're vulnerable and you're open to this new life that
Yes.
like my last book was a 21-year-old female savant set in 1987. I'm like, all right, we'll see what
That's
happens.
terrific.
But it is so much more joyful because it's the act of discovery, I think, which is part of that joy.
Yes.
And if you're kind of writing what you know, which I think is bullshit, I mean, I think it's great for some people, but the idea that you have to write what you know is completely stupid. It is something very freeing about that.
I agree. I agree. It's interesting, in the past few years in Hollywood especially, there's sort of a, ethos that says stay in your lane. Only write what you know, only write from your own lived experience. And um, I understand a little bit about where that mindset comes from, but the truth of the matter is that if we only limited authors and writers of all stripes to their lived experience, God, the number of books and movies and television shows and just great works of art, that we would be deprived of, it's
Right.
shocking to think in those
Right.
terms. And I again, I don't know how much that has served the cause of art. that idea that you should only write what you know or stay in your lane or write from your lived experience, however you want to put it. I don't know if the ROI on that is all that high.
Yeah, I mean, you look at, I mean, the best TV is batshit crazy TV. Like, you look at the pilot of Breaking Bad, for example,
It's
and
funny, I was
you,
just thinking about Breaking Bad
yeah,
because I know Vince Gilligan, and I'm here to tell you he is as far from Walter White as it gets.
right, right,
Um, and you're so much more. I mean, yes, Vince is a straight white guy the same way Walter is, but we're so much more than our sexual orientation or our gender or our race. I we're more than those. We're more than our identities. And Walter is this incredible character, one of the greatest characters in the history of television, who has nothing in common at
right,
all with Vince.
right. But what Vince Gilligan understands is the conceit of a character who he knows within the very first episode, the viewers are going to have such great empathy because of how he starts. And then I'm sure Vince Gilligan's saying, like, how can I twist this guy over the course of X number of seasons so he becomes detestable, but you're still rooting for him? That's what probably Vince Gilligan understands. Doesn't know anything about meth dealing, but
Right.
that's the most interesting thing is let's set this in a world that people might not know about, but is really fascinating to see.
Yes.
And it's not that hard to do, but if as long as that emotion and that empathy holds true throughout the book, throughout the series, whatever, that's what you need, I think, to hook somebody. Because yeah, I've seen some things that are the greatest plots ever, but I'm not connected to this because I don't give a shit about the characters.
Yeah, I'm a huge I sort of worship at the altar of emotional engagement.
100%.
If the audience, and it doesn't matter what type of audience, because it doesn't matter what type of medium, if the audience is emotionally engaged, they'll let you rob a bank. That's all that really matters. In Hollywood, the vast majority of executives you deal with, all they care about are logic is logic. And
Mm.
they don't care about, it's not even emotional logic, it's purely plot logic. And what I often want to tell them, and sometimes do tell them, is if the audience is asking themselves these questions, we have much bigger problems. Because if the audience is asking themselves these questions, it means that they're not emotionally engaged.
Right.
And if they're not, because the audience doesn't watch a movie or watch a TV show the same way a creative exec in Hollywood does.
Right. Right.
They're not looking for they only, their minds only start to wander towards the logic problems if their hearts are not invested in the story.
Yeah, that's true. And this is probably highly reductive, but the layperson reads a screenplay and it's just stage direction and dialogue, and it is really hard when you don't have when you're not used to doing that to pull the emotion out of that. But that all comes to life through the production, through the director's vision of it and things like that. With the novel, you can sit there, and especially depending on what point of view you're writing from, on every page you can have a sense of how does this character feel, what are they
Yes.
if the author is allowing you into those insights.
I will say when I write a screenplay, I try very hard to, at the very least, convey in the stage direction the tone that I want the story to have.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, I'm not always successful at that, but I think the really good screenplays are the ones that don't just feel like I mean, a screenplay at the end of the day is a blueprint for a movie, but the really good screenplays don't feel like that. The really
Yeah.
good screenplays draw you in and make you feel the way an actual, flesh and blood film does. One example that I always use is Tony Gilroy's draft of Michael Clayton, the movie that he wrote and
I
directed.
literally just watched that. I hadn't seen it since it came out, and I'm like, I gotta watch this again. And it was 3 nights ago. I watched Michael Clayton again, and I remember not really caring for it. I thought it was kind of slow, and then I watched it again. I'm like, this is one of the best movies I've ever seen.
Oh, it's one of my all-time favorite films. And if you read the screenplay, which I recommend to everybody, if you read the screenplay, you'll see, oh, wow, everything that movie was on the page. Tony manages to write in a way that makes you really, feel the entire movie.
Right.
It's an incredible gift. It's not this dry, boring stage direction that a lot of screenplays have. So, yeah, if you're a fan of the movie, I cannot recommend the screenplay highly enough.
You know what? The one thing, and I always do, this, especially if it's a good movie, I watch the movie and then I just go into a rabbit hole of reviews because I love
Sure,
reading critical analysis because it's
sure.
fascinating to me. Um, but one thing I didn't find, I was watching the movie, and if this is a spoiler for anyone, the movies came out 20 years ago, so get over it. Um, when he goes up to the horses
Yes.
and the car explodes, I'm like, why did he go up to the horse? I mean, you can weave a few, and I so was wanting something earlier in the movie to
By the
have,
way,
yeah,
the answer is in the screenplay.
but not in the final
Um,
cut.
well, it's
Or
interesting. I
or did
think
I
that's a
miss it?
No, I don't think you missed it. I think it's a great example of something in the screenplay that just didn't end up on screen.
Yeah,
Not was filmed and cut out. But in the screenplay, the stage direction is something along the lines of like Michael gets out of the car, drawn to these horses, wanting to see something pure, wanting and needing to experience something pure. And now that's obviously an incredibly interior concept,
yes,
um, that is it's it doesn't reach the screen. And I agree with you. I at the horses, especially since because of the nonlinear structure of that particular movie, um, you're not in Michael's headspace
right.
in that moment because you haven't experienced all the things that he's about to experience in flashback. So, but it's interesting that you mention that particular moment in the movie because it is on the page, if though it's not on the screen.
Because as from the writer's perspective, all I was thinking is like, because you kind of can infer that because it is a scene where he is in such internal chaos
Yes,
and moving at such a fast speed
that's
that to
right.
stop and absorb that kind of makes sense that he's just looking for some kind of mental clarity.
Yes.
But I just thought, man, if I were writing this somewhere early on, I would have had the other character who ends up getting murdered tell him like in his, because he's crazy and he's off his meds, but have some kind of soliloquy of, have you ever looked into a horse's eyes? Do you know what they,
Right.
and
Yes.
just have something like that as a
Yes.
trigger. But anyway, so I love that critical examination. But just getting back to your novel. So when you complete this novel, how, and sell the novel, how does that emotionally compare to everything else that you've done in the writing space?
Gosh, it's tough. It's tough to answer that because I am not, I'll be honest, I am not particularly well connected to my emotions.
Mm,
And I think when I sold it, I just felt this sense of relief.
mhm, mhm.
You know, um,
Because that's
and
an
and
incredibly
then
hard thing to do, is to sell your first book or any
it,
book.
it yeah, no, like in many ways it really was my first novel because the original first novel didn't do anything for me in the literary space. So it was almost like I never wrote a previous novel before. And it I'll be honest, when something great like that happens, I don't quite know emotionally how to process it. So I I just felt relief. It feels surreal.
Yeah.
Um, you know, and things being surreal, that's not an emotion, but that's in my, crazy way of operating and working my way through the world. It is almost an emotion. And and similarly when I got my first copies of the book and held it in my
Right.
hand and you know and I go, wow, it's sort of like when I got married or when my children were born. It's like, okay, this is one of those big moments that I should really sort of take in and process. But it's hard for me.
Yeah.
These are one of the things I struggle with. And I mean, it's very reductive and simplistic to say feels really good. but it does. It feels really
Right.
good. And then of course I quickly have to, that becomes uncomfortable for me to feel. So I quickly shift over to anxiety, which is a much more familiar and therefore comfortable emotion for me. And I go, oh my God, are people going to like it? Are people going
Yeah.
to think this is
Right.
bad?
Right.
And because I will say, and you know this as a novelist, there's nothing there's no form of writing that's more intimate. In a screenplay or a teleplay or a comic book, you can hide behind the actors and the artists and the director, but it's all just you in a novel, and it's not just you, but it's your brain, your thoughts, your way of seeing the world that
Hmm.
is on display on every page. So you're honestly you I feel exposed.
Right.
And I think that's both wondrous and scary, and
Right.
it's a bit like being in love. It's
Right.
like you're there you are, naked for the world to see. And at the end of the day, like I said, I just felt this release because it had been such a long road to get to this
Yeah.
point. And again, which brings me right back to, God, it's just surreal. It's like,
It
who
is.
would have
It
thought,
is.
it'll be 10 years, almost to the day practically when the novel comes out, than when I first started writing
Oh,
my
wow.
first set of notes about it. Not writing, the novel, but just everything I do, no matter what medium it is, it always just begins with me writing longhand on a piece of paper,
Oh, wow.
um,
Uh-huh.
thoughts and notes and emotions, and you know, some lines of dialogue, but some, images, some set pieces. It all is very, it's very, primordial.
Right.
It's
Right.
just an ooze
Right. Right.
before it slowly starts to take form and get refined.
Yeah, and I think that vulnerability is interesting too. Like the idea of like, are people going to like this? Do people now have this insights into my inner soul that
Yes.
I don't necessarily want them to have? And then after a while, that becomes something you embrace in a way, like going to a book club and you're sitting there in front of a bunch of people and they are dissecting your book to your face, and some of them just abjectly do not like it. And then the feeling of like, I am totally cool with that. Like I'm
Yeah.
not for everyone. Or I
Yeah.
wrote a scene that was like so disturbing maybe that they look at me differently, and I'm just like, but there's a layer that's lifted off. That doesn't mean you're a disturbing person, but that you're like, okay, I went through that criticism and I'm fine. And it's
Yeah.
amazing how that lifts off of you after a while, time and time again. I'm curious to know, because so for example, like I've never written a screenplay, but I have an idea and I was thinking about it, and it's totally different than stuff I normally write. And I'm like, I think this only works as a screenplay. So maybe I'll figure out how to do that. But in my mind, I don't have any aspirations to like write multiple screen. I'm like, I just want to do this maybe and see what that looks like. Now for you on the novel side, are you like, all right, book number two, book number three, I'm ready to go?
Oh, yeah. I already started working on the next novel.
Because the
Because again,
publishers, just to the listeners, the publishers will say, what else do you have? Because that goes into the decision of buying your first book.
that's very true. That's very true. And they did ask me that question.
Yeah.
So I've already started the next novel. I don't want to wait nearly 10 years between novels.
Right.
But that's in large part because I had such a good time writing this one. And I kind of see now, in my perfect world, novels are, as regular a part of my output and my creativity as television, film, and comic books are.
Interesting. Interesting. Well, Mark, we're going to wrap up. Before we do, we're going to do the storytelling portion of the show, which I'm sure you've been
Okay.
looking forward to. We're going to pick a random book from my bookshelf, and we're going to pick a random page, and I'm going to choose a sentence. I'm going to read that sentence out loud, and then that'll be the first sentence in maybe a 2 or 3 minute long short story. So I'll read that sentence, then you give me the next one or two sentences. I'll do a couple sentences, and then when it becomes a total shit show, I'll just call it a day. Um,
Okay.
So give me a color of a book.
Red.
Okay. So speaking of comics, this was actually this is Denver
Oh,
Moon by my buddies Warren Hammond and Josh Viola. And this is actually the novel version of the comic series.
interesting.
Um, yeah, they're very talented guys. So give me a page number, but so this is sci-fi, but we can do whatever we want with it. Give me a page between 1 and 200.
Okay, let's go with 123.
Okay. Um, right. I'm just going to read this sentence. Um, and you do whatever the hell you want to do with it. I didn't flinch or close my eyes.
I just gripped the gun tighter in my hand and pulled the trigger.
All those years at the firing range, I never thought I would actually be shooting something besides a target. And I tried so hard to think of him as that, just a target. But everything changed when I saw the blood.
And this face that looked so familiar to mine suddenly lost all expression as my brother's body hit the floor.
I walked over, knelt beside him, not even bothering to check for a pulse, knowing there was none. And I stared down at him, trying to detach myself from the reality of what just happened, realizing there was no way going back. I could not rewind the clock. All I could do was focus on moving forward. Unfortunately, moving forward meant hiding the body.
The term dead weight is legitimately earned. There's nothing quite as heavy as a human being whose metaphorical marionette strings have been cut.
I stood up, kept looking down at him, and of all the things I've cursed my brother about in my head over the last 30 years, the one that pops into my head now was his affinity for fast food. My brother outweighed me by 200 pounds. And as gruesome as the itch of a thought came to me, I knew there was no way I was going to move him away in one piece.
And so I climbed down the stairs of his house towards the garage, which I hoped would contain a means by which I could dismember my own flesh and blood.
Oh, I think we call it there. That was lovely. I think the name of that short story is something like The Rusty Hacksaw.
Love it. Love it.
It always,
Um,
I've done this 150 times and it always gets really dark really fast.
yeah, I know. There's just something about writers, I guess.
Yeah, it's just that conflict that you want to have. That was fantastic. Well, I
Yeah, that
appreciate
was
you.
fun. That was
I
a really fun
appreciate your
exercise. I never done
humor
something
too.
like that before.
Yeah, so it's just kind of an improv, which is kind of nice because I
Yeah,
love the idea of I have an idea, but then I have to accept whatever you give me.
yeah.
And that's always usually invigorating. I'm like, oh yeah, let's do that. And then it goes somewhere else. And I don't know. It's always a good time. But listen, man, congratulations on your upcoming release in any lifetime. I'm excited to see it. It's a beautiful cover, and
Thank you.
it does, from what I've read about it, it does appear to be a very emotional book, and that's very cool. And I find this duality about you a little interesting. The idea that you're emotion forward in your writing, but you're self-professed kind of have a hard time checking in on your own emotions. So it's
Well, I think, this sort of takes us full circle, but I think, so much of my childhood, like we were talking about, is full of contradictions.
Mm-hmm.
If I was writing myself as a character, I would say, a boy who had a lot of inner contradictions would grow up to be a man with a lot of inner contradictions.
Makes the most interesting people. Well, nice to meet you, and I hope we get to meet
Thank
in
you.
person someday. And thank you for your time,
That'd
Mark.
be lovely. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Take care. So that's it. That is my conversation with Marc Guggenheim. I love that one, and I kind of dug the creepy little story about sibling murder at the end there. Mark's new book, In Any Lifetime, looks fantastic. You can find out more about the book and more about Mark at his website, marcguggenheim.com. That's Mark with a C at the end of it. And while you're on the internet, pop on over to carterwilson.com, and there you can check out all of my books, check out episodes of Making It Up. You can subscribe to my newsletter and see my event dates. And if you go over to unboundwriter.com, you can read all about my upcoming Boulder writing coaching program and retreat in October. You can look at the services I offer for one-on-one writing coaching, as well as writing classes online. That's it for now, folks. Always appreciate you watching and or listening. There will be another episode of Making It Up out just next week. In the meantime, as always, take care.